What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So the Final Fantasy Pixel Remasters have finally been updated with the features and quality of life changes that have previously been exclusive to the console versions of these games, since the console versions came out a good amount of time after they released on PC. So I took that as a sign to jump on in, as I've been intending to do for a while. This update includes, but is not limited to, toggles for the OST between the new arrangements and the classic soundtrack, a font toggle between the newer font, which people had a lot of problems with, and a classic font that looks a lot better, a toggle for turning encounters on and off without having to dig through menus, boosters for experience, money, and some other things depending on which game you're playing, etc. and so on. I had previously never played these first three games, though I was already somewhat familiar with them through watching the occasional video essay, but I'm glad that I've now experienced them firsthand. I've completed the achievement lists in these first three games 100%, and this is not something that I had intended going in, but towards the end of my playthrough of the original Final Fantasy, it seemed achievable enough to where I figured I would go for it. And thankfully, it didn't seem like there was much in the form of missable content. In Final Fantasy 2 and 3, however, there are missables, and in FF2, unfortunately, I missed some things to the point where I had to start a new playthrough after beating the game initially in order to unlock the remaining achievements. And then in FF3, I pulled up a guide ahead of time to make sure that I didn't miss any potential missables. With all that said, my playtime in each of these games was just under 9 hours for the original Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy 2 is sitting at around 13, although I think I beat the game closer to like 9 or 10 hours, and those last 2 or 3 were starting a fresh playthrough to clean up those missables. And then Final Fantasy 3 took me somewhere between 12 and 14 hours. Steam has it marked at just under 14 hours, but I think it's probably closer to 13 or maybe even 12 and a half of actual playtime. And with a lot of that introductory stuff out of the way, I am trying to hit 1,000 subscribers as soon as I can, so I can set a new goal for the end of 2024. I do want to thank all of you who have subscribed recently, and of course those who have continued to stick around as well. Before I break down each of these 3 games individually, I want to touch on the presentation aspects to all 3 of them, and this really could also apply to 4 through 6 as well, since all 6 of these games were updated very uniformly, which I think is kind of cool, especially with the classic font. It makes things look a lot better in that uniform style, and of course just the sprite work in general is better looking than I actually expected. Pixel art is one of those things that is pretty timeless, but the visual updates are much appreciated. I also have to mention the soundtrack as well. I mean, I was well aware that Nobuo Uematsu is a god-tier composer, but the arrangements of the OSTs in these remasters really goes to show the quality of the original compositions, that they can be adapted so seamlessly with this updated instrumentation, which just does a lot to bring these worlds to life even more than the original chiptune versions, which, as I mentioned previously, you can toggle between. And as far as I'm aware, at least, Uematsu supervised the production of these arranged soundtracks. So even if he didn't handle them directly, I think it's safe to say he was involved enough to give his blessing, so to speak. Now let's move into talking about each of these games individually. So the original Final Fantasy was one of 3 out of these 6 pixel remasters that were originally released in the West back during the 80s and 90s. Being, of course, this first game, Final Fantasy IV, which was labeled as Final Fantasy II in the West, and Final Fantasy VI, which was labeled as Final Fantasy III in the West. We would eventually get access to Final Fantasy II, III, and V via various ports and collections in the generations following these games' original releases. Let's start with story in the original Final Fantasy, since I already talked presentation. Essentially, the world is shrouded in darkness, and there's a prophecy that the 4 Warriors of Light will show up to restore the power of the crystals to seal away the darkness. And so at the very beginning of the game, you are instructed to go to the Chaos Shrine to kill Garland, who had kidnapped the princess. But then following that, once the bridge is repaired and you head off on your journey, the game just kind of says, all right, go restore the crystals and good luck. And there's not really much beyond that, as far as more direct storytelling is concerned. I find it kind of hard to pinpoint how to describe this game's tone. It does take itself seriously, but not quite in the same way as other games in the series. I think the best I can put it is that it feels very mythical, kind of like you're playing through a legend that's been passed down generation over generation. And I think the relative sparseness of the story kind of contributes to this, almost like you're meant to fill in the gaps in your head, or by talking to random townsfolk who more directly refer to various events and bits of lore that help fill in the context for the journey that you're on throughout this game. There is also a twist at the end that's pretty cool and prevents the game from from feeling like just a generic fantasy game. But beyond that, I guess you would view this story as being primarily just the actions that the character is taking as opposed to a more cinematic presentation, if you want to call it that, which is perfectly fine. I wasn't really expecting a particularly fleshed out story for this first game. Like, a lot of the events in this game feel somewhat isolated from each other, as opposed to the world feeling a little bit more connected and, I guess, believable in a sense. But it actually has me curious to check out Stranger of Paradise. I know that game takes place in the original Final Fantasy world, which of course all of these games are disconnected, barring a few sequels here and there, but numbered entries are set in completely different worlds with completely different casts of characters and political structures and magic systems and all that jazz. But yeah, even if Stranger of Paradise does kind of take a different approach in its tone and whatnot, it does have me curious, I guess. What I liked about this game is that the world feels very quantifiable. It was very easy for me to memorize where a lot of places were. Structurally and progression-wise, it reminds me a lot of the original Legend of Zelda, just obviously with random encounters and turn-based combat. But you know, you acquire a key item, figure out where to take it to get the next key item, which allows you to get to the next place, which gets you the next key item, etc., and so on. Particularly when it comes to the modes of transportation that you unlock, being the boat, the canoe, and the airship. There is definitely a good bit of old-school obtuseness in figuring out where to go. Talking to NPCs can help with this, and of course, the internet is a resource that can be used for helping out with that as well if you're really stuck. If you're doing a lot of aimless wandering, it definitely can take more time than you might want. And I guess the random encounters are intended to break up that monotony, as it were, but it's not like the encounters aren't kind of monotonous in their own way. I actually found turning off encounters to be kind of a lifesaver, even if it does quote-unquote trivialize the traversal in a sense. But these early JRPGs are so grindy anyway that I don't really view it as much of an issue. It's not like I'm sitting here complaining about the game being too easy because of the ability to do this. In fact, I'd be much more likely to complain if I couldn't turn off the encounters, or if I couldn't use boosters to speed up grinding when I found it to be warranted. And it definitely did feel warranted at times, especially so in this first game. I pretty much kept the boosters on pretty high for pretty much the entire game, but I didn't end up being what I viewed as being over-leveled, since I fought the final boss with a team of level 50s, which I believe was the level cap for the original game, which was lifted in this game. So in a sense, I'm kind of glad that I didn't go past level 50 for the final boss. In addition to the boosters being nice for grinding, the auto battle feature is also super nice, where turning on the auto battle feature will repeat your party's actions that they took the previous turn, and also physically speeds up the battles as well. I don't really have many complaints. And then plus you can definitely do more playthroughs with a different party setup, because you get to choose the classes for each of your party members at the start of the game. Now, it is set in stone, so there's no going back if you start a playthrough with 4 white mages or like whatever. Generally good to just have each party member be a different class. Your party members do get promotions to their classes later on, but they're generally going to be filling the same role. And then beyond that, the combat is just kind of standard turn-based. I did find the magic system to be kind of interesting though, where your party members who can use magic have MP for each level of spell. The level 1 spells are like Cure and Fire, and then you go up a couple levels and it's Cura and Fyra, and then eventually Curaga and Fyraga. There's other ones like Haste and Status Afflicting and Healing spells and whatnot mixed in there, but as your magic users gain regular levels, their MP pool for each of these levels of magic that they can learn increase. Although you can only learn 3 spells per level of magic, and so sometimes you have to pick and choose, although you can forget spells in order to make room to learn new ones if you want to overwrite one. And each of these levels of magic does cap at 9 MP, which is notable because of how Final Fantasy III's magic system works, which is very similar to this one. But that's pretty much all I have to say on the original Final Fantasy. I never went into this game expecting it to be like my favorite game of all time, or even one of my favorites in the series, but because of how compact it was, in addition to these quality of life features, I found it to be pretty enjoyable. Now moving on to Final Fantasy II, starting with the story, of course. FF2 takes a much more direct storytelling approach, as well as a more serious and grounded tone. Now typically, Final Fantasy IV gets credited for this shift to the more direct storytelling, which on one hand is understandable since Final Fantasy IV was labeled as Final Fantasy II in the West. And even though I'd say Final Fantasy IV's story is better than FF2's, I think that Final Fantasy II does deserve some recognition for shifting towards this more overt narrative focus. The party members in this game are actually named and have distinct personalities, I guess if you want to call it that, because I'd say that the characterization in FF2 is pretty bare bones. Definitely more fleshed out than the first game, but still not much to write home about. There are some funny moments and quirky side characters and whatnot that did keep the narrative and characterization somewhat enjoyable. It is a step in the right direction, but it's not quite to the level of being so fleshed out that I felt super invested. I was more so just kind of curious to see what would happen next. And so the setup for this story story is that your 4 party members, Firion, Maria, Guy, and Leon, are on the run from the Empire. Leon is presumed dead as the first 3 wake up following their rescue, so a lot of the tasks you have are helping out with the rebel cause. One of the first things you do is you go off to get Mithril for the rebel army's blacksmith so he can make more powerful weapons and armor for the soldiers that are fighting in this war, which isn't really shown super clearly. The world of this game does change as the story progresses, but obviously limitations on the original Famicom prevented this rebellion against the Empire from being presented in as grand a fashion as I think that the game's story implicates. And so in that sense, this game kind of feels ahead of its time. I think there's a lot of potential with this story, even if there is goofy stuff like Guy speaking Beaver, among other things. But generally the tone feels like it's trying to be very grounded, even if there is fantastical stuff going on. The world is still very open, maybe a little too open. It is one of those things where it's like, okay, it's nice being able to go to these towns earlier than you're intended to, but there's not really much of a purpose, except maybe getting some better equipment. There are powerful random encounters in certain areas that do try to prevent you from going to these areas, but this is one of those cases where turning off the encounters does kind of trivialize or sort of ruin, in a sense, the danger present out there. And that's, I guess, intended to be sort of a method of guidance for the player. Although generally I'd say that objectives are more clear in this game than FF1, since you are reporting to Princess Hilda and her advisors and whatnot regarding what to do next. In addition to acquiring different methods of traversal, being the canoe, the boat, and the airship, as it was in FF1, you have key terms that you can learn when talking to certain NPCs, which you can then go inquire about to other NPCs. The NPCs you can do this with are extremely limited, so it doesn't feel as open and flexible as how Fallout and even Morrowind's dialogue kind of operates, but it is much simpler, so I don't feel like it adds a ton that couldn't just be baked into character dialogue. Like, instead of talking to someone and having to select Wild Rose, which is the Resistance passphrase, to earn certain characters' trust so they'll give you the intel that you need, instead of having to select that, they could have just had Firion be like, hey, we're with the Resistance, and just like say that without player input. And this is how it's handled in future games. There's no dialogue system, key term kind of thing in the following games, as far as I'm aware at least. But while I don't feel like it adds much that couldn't just be implemented automatically, I do think it is something that makes Final Fantasy II feel distinct in its own way. And speaking of that distinctness, the way that leveling works in this game is very different from the rest of the series, where instead of selecting a class and just having a standard level up system from that, Final Fantasy II is skill based, where you have your proficiency levels in swords, axes, bows, that you level up individually by using them in battle. As far as I understand it, you at least need to act with said skill you're trying to level up more than once in a battle to gain experience for said skill. Let's say you have your standard party of 3, Firion, Maria, and Guy. There's a rotating 4th party member, which is another thing that reminds me of FF4. And you run into 3 enemies, each of which your party members one-shot. Because they only acted once, I don't think you would gain skill level experience from that. There are ways to manipulate this, right? Having 2 characters defend and letting the single character you're trying to level up a skill for be the one to act many times throughout the battle to take out the enemies, etc. and so on. And this leads to a game that feels very grindy, but somewhat in a different way than just accruing levels in the traditional sense, which actually kind of makes me think of Final Fantasy VIII and how the junction system works. It's definitely different than FF8, but similar in a sense where in FF8 it can feel grindy, but not because you're grinding levels. Thankfully, of course, the boosters in these Pixel Remasters helped a ton. In this game, I pretty much kept the boosters at max, maybe with the exception of money, since spells and whatnot were not nearly as expensive as they are in the original Final Fantasy. And I never felt like I was super overpowered, but it was also kind of hard to tell because there's not an explicit, you are this level. It's like, okay, how high of a skill level is too high for certain bosses, right? I'm sure there is a quantifiable way to calculate that. I can't imagine that the standard experience rate would be enough to get you through the game, because there were actually a lot of times in this game where my characters weren't proficient enough in various skills to actually do any damage to the enemy. And of course, sometimes this was because they were more vulnerable to magic, but a lot of the time it was just that the enemy's defense stat neutralized whatever attack output I could put out at the time. And similarly to your weapon skills, magic functions the same way, where you level up each spell individually. And so instead of having Cure, Cura, and Curaga, you just have the Cure spell, which you level up by using it, be it in combat or otherwise, and that increases the power of that base Cure spell. Also, MP pools in this game are much more traditional, where it's just like another stat, as opposed to being limited by level of spell. Since the spell levels are on a case-by-case basis, depending on how much you've leveled them yourself, you are limited to how many spells you can learn, but you've got more than enough to learn whatever you could possibly need, especially across all 3 of your characters, since obviously because the game is skill-based, any character can equip anything. It's just a matter of once you've kind of invested into certain skills, you probably want to just stick with that, but you can kind of build them however you want. And I think the last thing I want to note about the gameplay in Final Fantasy II is the dungeons, which I didn't really know anything about the dungeons in the first game, just not really much to say, I guess. So like there were some dungeons where there were small empty rooms in the larger room that you were in, but it would just be a matter of popping in, checking, nope, nothing in there, popping out. It was instant. Whereas in FF2, there are, I think, a lot more dead ends, and the game also has to fade to black every single time. And so there's this screen transition every time you enter and exit a door, and because it's not clear as to where the staircases are to go to the next floor, it can feel very tedious and unnecessarily time-consuming exploring these dungeons, because you'll pop into 9 out of 10 rooms and there will be nothing in them. Occasionally there will be treasure chests, and so I guess unless you're following a guide very intricately, you're gonna feel pressure to check all of them if you're going for 100%, or even just looking for the staircase to like actually progress. But that was something that really annoyed the shit out of me, way more so than the skill leveling system. I could totally see this game in its vanilla state being obnoxious because of how grindy and tedious getting skill levels is. In this Pixel Remaster state, I actually didn't hate it. Now, would I want to see some of these things return, like skill levels or this particular style of dungeon design? No, not at all. But I don't really hold it against this game for being a little more experimental in its gameplay systems, which is kind of a hallmark of Final Fantasy as we know it now, but maybe even more so considering this was a Famicom sequel, which tended to kind of deviate since there wasn't really a standardization for how console game sequels should work. Let's move on to Final Fantasy III, where the plot setup in FF3 feels very similar to the original Final Fantasy, where you're the 4 warriors of light looking to restore the crystals and cleanse the darkness that has overtaken the land or whatever. Although in this game you don't get that kind of cool twist at the end, which does lead to a fairly traditional feeling narrative, but it has a more fantastical and heroic tone compared to the first 2 games, which does help set it apart. The world and the way you progress through it in Final Fantasy III is a lot clearer on where to go. The game doesn't really let you aimlessly wander as much, especially early on. Whereas the first 2 games may be linear in their progression, this game kind of wears the linearity on its sleeve a little bit more, which I don't fault it for because these games are linear. Sure, you can explore and whatnot, but as I mentioned with FF2, I feel like that exploration of much of the world map early on just doesn't really benefit you that much compared to just going to where the game wants you to go. And so I appreciated that much more focused approach. I felt like I didn't really need to look up where to go. Maybe there were 1 or 2 things, but I think that was more so for 100% completion purposes rather than just trying to beat the game. Because there are some missables in this game as well. There are missable guides on Steam regarding the achievement lists that definitely helped a lot. I made sure to kind of follow it somewhat during my playthrough of FF3, which prevented me from having to start a new game to get some of the missables. I made sure that I cleaned them up as I went. I will say the dungeons felt pretty short compared to the first 2 games, maybe with the exception of the last few. But this did keep the game kind of moving at what felt like a pretty brisk pace. I also thought that the way that this game uses the mini and toad spells was kind of cool, where you actually need to cast these status effects on your party in order to access certain areas. Now, what wasn't clear to me is that you could undo this in certain instances and be fine. You have to cast the spell on yourself again to undo it. Resting in an inn in this game only restores your HP and MP. It doesn't restore status. I think partially because there is a town where you are miniaturized, and so you kind of need to stay in that status state. So instead, you have to either rely on status restoring items or spells, or finding a status restoring fountain, which were fairly rare, I think. I think it was more common to run into an HP and MP one, and maybe a revival ones. This game returned to a class-based system as opposed to being skill-based, and this game famously did implement the job system, which was known for existing in the Dragon Quest series over on the Enix side of things, since this was well before Square and Enix merged to form Square Enix as we know it today. But the job system allows you to change your party's classes on the fly, and so while you do generally want to keep your characters in the physical damage realm or the magical damage realm, you do have that flexibility to swap your classes or jobs as they're called, with not really any cost to you. Although there's not much benefit to jumping around too much, unless you're simply upgrading to a higher tier class, like going from warrior to knight or monk to black belt. There was at least one gimmick boss where you basically need to swap your whole party to the dragoon class. I get that this was probably implemented to incentivize players to swap jobs around if they weren't, but it feels a little bit bit forced and kind of lame, because I don't know how the hell you're supposed to beat that boss without swapping 2 Dragoons unless you are extremely overleveled. And when you do take the Dragoon route, you just kind of spam the jump command on everyone and pray that it works out, since the turn order in this game seems fairly arbitrary for some reason. That is one reason I'm very much looking forward to moving on to FF4, since the turn order is much more determined in that game and clear because of how ATB works. I wasn't paying attention enough in the first 2, but in 3 I noticed there were times where sometimes the boss would act first, sometimes they wouldn't, and so it was just kind of unclear and just kind of frustrating in a way where I feel like it should be consistent based on like a speed or agility stat or something. FF3 is the first of these games that has what I would deem to be somewhat substantial side content, with fighting the optional bosses to unlock various summons, and that was pretty fun, although Odin did fuck me up several times before I decided to go grind and come back later. And the magic system is very similar to the original Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster, at least, with the exception of MP for each level of magic not capping at just 9. I think this is dependent on what job you have equipped, because I noticed that the values changed when I went from White Mage to Sage at the very end. But yeah, overall Final Fantasy III was pretty easily the one of these 3 games that I enjoyed the most. I don't think the story quite resonated with me still, and even though this game didn't have a big twist at the end that recontextualizes the game like in the original Final Fantasy, this game did have an unexpected moment for me, and I guess I'll just say without spoiling, since I don't feel like that's necessary. When it's time to go to the water crystal and you do what you need to do to get to the water crystal, I thought that was really novel and cool, since I didn't know very much about this game's setting. And so yeah, those are my thoughts on the first 3 Final Fantasy Pixel Remasters, and now that I'm through 100%ing these first 3 games, I am very much looking forward to replaying Final Fantasy IV, and of course 6 once I get around to that. 5 I played a little bit of, but not nearly in full, and so I'm looking forward to that in its own way, but I'm probably going to do individual videos on 4, 5, and 6, because I think there's going to be more to say on them individually than these first 3. Go ahead and let me know what you guys think about the Final Fantasy Pixel Remasters, particularly these first 3, of course. These games, thanks to those quality of life improvements and whatnot, do hold up a lot better than I expected. More than anything, I'm just glad that I experienced these games in some form, at the very least for historical purposes, and I even found that I got more enjoyment out of them than I expected overall. It's just very cool to see this progression of the series from the very beginning, as someone who's played a good number of the later entries. Before I sign off, I do want to thank my channel members, as always, and shout out the Space Cowboy at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.